Have you ever imagined what happens when the person you trust most is the very one who exposes you, who humiliates you in front of everyone? When your heart, full of faith and hope, is broken not by enemies, but by someone you believed was sent by God? This is a pain many Christian women carry in silence, fearing judgment, abandonment, and even the label of weak in faith. But today I decided not to remain silent. Hi, my name is Sarah Johnson. I'm 32 years old, and I want to open my heart to you. This isn't just a story about a relationship gone wrong. It's about betrayal, public shaming, and how imposed silence can hurt more than words. Maybe you felt it too. That moment when everything falls apart, but you have to keep smiling to keep up appearances within the church to avoid being seen as someone who failed. I was in love, believing I was living God's will for my life. The man I called my boyfriend was seen by many as an example, a true servant of the Lord. But what one knew was that behind the looks and compliments, there were small actions that already pointed to a silent disrespect. I ignored it, thinking love covered everything, that it was just a phase, until the day came when he publicly exposed me in front of people I considered brothers in Christ. The humiliation was so great that I felt as if I had lost not only the relationship, but also my dignity. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever felt the weight of being judged, of being silenced? When all you wanted to do was scream your pain. What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because what I experienced isn't just about suffering, but also about choices, about courage, and about rediscovering my true identity in God. Stay with me until the end, because this story can also be a mirror of yours. And what happened after that day was something that completely changed the way I see faith, love, and even myself. If someone had told me that the man I loved would publicly humiliate me, I would never have believed them, because deep down, I had built a perfect image of him. I saw him as someone of impeccable character, a respected leader, an example to everyone around him. And when you believe this so strongly, it's almost impossible to see the signs that were right before my eyes. Little phrases that belittled me in private, actions that made me uncomfortable, but which I justified with ready-made excuses. I told myself that every relationship has ups and downs, that it was just a phase. But the hidden truth was that I was already being silenced long before that scene that marked my life. That day, in front of so many people in the church, he launched words that wounded me like sharp arrows. I felt as if every glance was judging me, as if everyone had seen something in me that I couldn't. The impact was so strong that for a few moments, I was paralyzed, unable to react. You know when the ground seems to disappear and you have nowhere to stand? It was exactly like that. And what hurt most wasn't just the words, but the silence of those present. People I called brothers in Christ lowered their eyes, changed the subject, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to cry. I wanted to run away, but I stayed still, caught between wounded pride and fear of judgment. And in that moment, I realized that my journey wouldn't just be about dealing with the pain of a broken relationship, but also with the masks we often wear within our faith. The masks that hide our weaknesses so others don't call us weak. The masks that try to sustain an image of perfection that doesn't exist. It was during this internal conflict that I began to realize the need for a profound transformation, not just external, but also in my mindset, in how I saw myself before God and myself. I needed to face the behind the scenes of my own story, to recognize the truths hidden behind the fear of disappointing others. And this decision to look within was painful, because it required courage to face what I had always avoided. Let's explore the deeper side of this issue together, because that's where the revelations begin that can completely change the way we understand relationships, faith, and even our own identity. Before all this happened, I was seen as that dedicated young Christian, always willing to serve, always smiling, full of dreams and energy for the future. In the eyes of many, I seemed to have my life together. I was involved in various church ministries, helped with youth groups, participated in worship rehearsals, and was always there when someone needed support. I believed that every detail of my life was unfolding according to God's purpose, and this filled me with enthusiasm. I had a vibrant faith, full of expectations about marriage, family, and projects that seemed to be under divine blessing. I was that person who arrived early, stayed late, and offered to help without complaining. You know that image of the good Christian girl that many idealize? I fit that stereotype perfectly. Not because I was a character, but because I genuinely believed I was building a solid path of faith. Behind the scenes, of course, I harbored my insecurities and fears. But I maintained the mindset that if I dedicated myself enough, God would reward me with the life of my dreams. And it was precisely in this scenario that he appeared, an admired young man, full of charisma, with a reputation as a true spiritual leader. When we started, getting closer, everything seemed to fall into place. People would comment, "What a blessed couple." And this only reinforced the idea that I was experiencing something special. I felt chosen, valued, as if I was finally reaping the rewards of all my right decisions. The impact of this phase was so intense that I didn't even notice the small details that would later make such a difference. Deep down, there was a hidden truth I didn't want to see. I was so enchanted by the ideal image I had constructed that I ignored the warning signs. I believed that the journey of faith automatically shielded the heart from disappointment, but that's not how life works. There's a huge difference between living your faith and hiding behind it to avoid facing reality. And I was living the latter, even without realizing it. This period, before the crisis, seemed perfect, but it already carried the seeds of the pain that would come. It's strange to think that the backstory of such a beautiful story can hide deep cracks, but that's precisely what happens when we choose appearance over essence. And when everything came to light, the impact wasn't just on my relationship, but on how I viewed myself, my faith, and even the environment I was in. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is at this point that the revelations begin to show how a heart full of good intentions can, without realizing it, become vulnerable to wounds that leave scars for a lifetime. I met him at one of those church youth gatherings, an environment that always gave me security and hope. We were gathered for a Bible study, and I vividly remember the first time our conversations crossed paths. He had a confident demeanor, an engaging way of speaking, and seemed to know the words so naturally that he caught everyone's attention. To me, that sounded like spiritual maturity, something I've always admired. In the days that followed, we began talking more, exchanging messages, and soon he was present in almost every aspect of my daily life within the church. I felt like God had placed someone special in my path, someone who shared the same values, the same faith, and the same dreams. The people around me also reinforced this idea. Many commented on what a beautiful couple we made, how it seemed we were made for each other, and deep down, I thrived on this approval. It was as if each compliment was divine confirmation that I was on the right path. He had that aura of a prince of God, someone who spoke beautifully about faith, who played the guitar in worship, who prayed with an intensity that was impressive. All of this moved me, making me believe I was before the man I had prayed so deeply for. Over time, our relationship became increasingly visible to the community. We were always together at events and activities, and that filled me with pride. I thought, finally, I'm living the promise I've been waiting for. I didn't realize, however, that I was more enchanted by the image than the essence. He knew how to carry himself in front of people, knew how to stand out, and I, immersed in the dream of building a Christian life alongside someone like that, ignored the details that might reveal a different reality. Behind the scenes, there were already small attitudes that made me uncomfortable, comments that sounded like jokes but carried a tone of disrespect. I silenced these discomforts, believing they were just human failings, that love endured all. This romanticizing mindset prevented me from seeing that often what seems like a great blessing can hide a hidden truth. I was so concerned with living up to community expectations, so enchanted by people's approval, that I failed to realize I was neglecting my own voice. It was as if I'd embarked on a journey where the destination seemed perfect, but the signs along the way screamed that something was wrong. Still, I refused to listen. This mix of idealization and emotional blindness had a huge impact because I allowed the narrative others constructed about us to become more important than how I truly felt. And when that happens, the decisions we make don't stem from our essence, but from the pressure of maintaining an image. This was one of the biggest revelations I had after all this, realizing how I was being shaped more by other people's expectations than by my own truth. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely at this point that the story begins, to take on more intense contours, revealing how small, ignored signs can turn into a painful wound when we least expect it. And as I found myself increasingly involved in this relationship that seemed perfect on the outside, something inside me began to scream silently. It was as if my heart was saying, "Something's wrong here," but I drowned out that voice with everyone's expectations, with the desire not to disappoint anyone. It was at this point that I realized how much we, as Christian women, often carry a heavy burden of conforming to standards, of upholding an image that doesn't always reflect the truth. This journey showed me that behind every smile, there can be hidden tears, and that the greatest battles are fought behind the scenes of the soul. And it's precisely because we share this kind of real and profound experience that I feel how important it is to have this space here. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what has touched you most so far, because your participation is what brings this conversation to life. Every time you comment, every time you open up, you not only strengthen your own journey, but also inspire other women going through similar situations. And if you want to continue following content like this, where hidden truths are brought to light and vulnerability finds acceptance, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is what makes this space grow and reach more people who need to hear messages of transformation and hope. It's not just a click, it's a gesture of support that strengthens an entire community seeking to live with greater authenticity and faith. And all of this connects with my own story, because throughout this process, I learned that what we share can have a much greater impact than we imagine. That's why I keep sharing, because every detail of this journey holds revelations that transformed my mindset and can also provoke deep reflections in those who listen to me. And the truth is that the next steps of this journey will show even more clearly how seemingly small decisions can completely change the course of our lives. As time passed, small signs began to appear, but I didn't see them as warning signs. They were subtle comments, disguised as jokes, that made me uncomfortable. Sometimes he'd joke about the way I sang in worship, or insinuate that I didn't understand the Bible as much as he did. I'd smile to avoid creating an atmosphere, swallow my words, and justify myself in my heart. He's just joking, it's just his way. But deep down, each sentence had a silent impact, slowly eroding my self-confidence. It's strange how certain attitudes seem harmless from the outside, but when you're in an emotionally involved relationship, your mindset creates excuses to avoid seeing the hidden truth. I remember one time when, in front of friends, he said I was too nice to be taken seriously. Everyone laughed, and I laughed along, even though I felt a lump in my throat. The pain came later when I got home and thought about the weight of that statement. It was as if my voice was diminished, as if my worth was measured only by the good girl image I carried. And yet, I chose to ignore it. I told myself that love had to endure certain things, that no one was perfect. This was one of the most dangerous decisions I ever made, choosing silence to avoid losing his approval. These details kept recurring over and over again. Sometimes in church meetings, he would interrupt me with sarcastic comments. Other times, he would make a point of comparing me to other women, always jokingly. I convinced myself it wasn't serious, that they were just words unintentionally hurtful, but in reality, they were fissures growing inside me. Today, I realize how ignoring these signs was opening the door to something bigger, as if every time I remained silent, I was giving permission for respect to be diminished. The journey to understanding this was long. During that time, I was so caught up in maintaining the image of a perfect relationship that I overlooked what should have been faced head-on. It was as if I was afraid to shatter the sandcastle we had built, even though I knew that each wave of disrespect made the foundation more fragile. The impact of this silence wasn't just on the relationship, but on my very identity. I gradually distanced myself from who I was, accepting a lesser role than the one God had created me for. And perhaps this is one of the hardest revelations to admit. When you ignore the signs, you end up betraying yourself even before being betrayed by someone else. This transformation from the inside out began precisely at that point, when I realized that my decisions to suppress my tears and hide my pain were shaping a weak and silent version of myself. I was living behind the scenes of a story that, to others, seemed perfect, but that inside was already falling apart. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely in this imposed silence that many women get lost, believing that enduring everything is synonymous with faith, when, in fact, it is the beginning of an emotional prison disguised as devotion. The day of humiliation is etched in my memory as if it had happened yesterday. We were at a church gathering, the kind where everyone seemed happy and relaxed, sharing stories and laughing together. I was sitting next to him, surrounded by friends I considered family, when suddenly he decided to share an intimate experience we'd experienced, something that should never have been exposed. He used my vulnerabilities as a joke, turning a conversation that should have been sacred between two people into a spectacle for all to see. At first, I didn't quite understand, thinking maybe he was exaggerating, but as he continued and the laughter echoed, shame overcame me in a way I'd never felt before. It was as if each word was a knife cutting through my dignity. I saw sidelong glances, people trying to hide their embarrassment, others laughing without realizing how much it was destroying me inside. The impact was so great that my body reacted, my hands trembled, my face burned, and an overwhelming urge to disappear took over me. I wanted to get up and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, as if trapped inside a nightmare. What hurt most wasn't just what he said, but where he said it. Inside the church, surrounded by people who should have been a place of support and safety. It was as if the faith that had always sustained me had been used against me. The hidden truth is that in that moment, it wasn't just him who hurt me, but also the silence of those around me. I expected a reaction, a word of support, any gesture that would show me I wasn't alone, but what I found was a deafening silence that made me feel even more exposed. This scene profoundly affected my mindset. Until then, I believed my worth was protected within that community, that I had a safe place there. But when I was ridiculed in front of everyone, I realized that the image I maintained wasn't enough to defend myself. It was as if, overnight, everything I believed about respect, complicity, and care had crumbled before my eyes. This public humiliation became a turning point in my journey. It was the moment I had to face, starkly, the reality that I wasn't in a healthy relationship, but rather in a cycle of disrespect disguised as love. And at the same time, it was the revelation that I needed to make different decisions if I wanted to regain my voice, my dignity, and my faith in myself. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the way we react to an experience of exposure and pain can define not only the course of a relationship, but also the way we begin to see ourselves before life and God. The immediate impact of that scene was devastating. I felt as if I had been stripped naked before everyone, not physically, but emotionally, in an even crueler way. The laughter of some still echoed in my ears, mixed with the heavy silence of others, and within me a feeling of emptiness took hold. It was as if the entire room had shrunk, and I had become tiny, unable to defend myself. The shock was so great that I couldn't react. The words simply wouldn't come out of my mouth. It was as if the fear of exposing myself further paralyzed me. Shame filled every part of my body. My face felt hot, my hands cold, my heart racing. The most painful thing was realizing that no one stood up, no one had the courage to break that embarrassment on my behalf. The silence of others seemed like confirmation that I deserved to be there, silent, bearing that humiliation alone. The impact of that moment was so profound that it made me question whether I truly had any value to those people who had always claimed to love me in Christ. On the way home, the scene replayed in my mind like an unstoppable movie. I wondered why I hadn't reacted, why I hadn't said anything. But at the same time, I understood that I was completely blocked, caught between loyalty to him and the desire to preserve my own dignity. It's frightening to realize how small decisions, like remaining silent in the face of an offense, can shape an entire mindset of submission. I didn't want to believe I was trapped in a cycle of disrespect, but the impact of that night made it clear that something inside me had broken. This experience became an invisible but very real wound. It affected not only the way I viewed my relationship, but also my very identity. I saw myself differently in the mirror, less confident, more insecure, as if I'd lost the strength to assert myself, and the silence of others, whom I expected to be my allies, became a harsh revelation that those around us don't always have the courage to speak out. This detail completely changed the way I began to interpret the behind-the-scenes aspects of faith and community. And perhaps the most striking thing about this immediate impact is how it made me see the hidden truth, that silence can be as violent as words, because it's not just the humiliation itself that hurts, but the feeling of being invisible to others at the moment when I most needed to be defended. This realization led me to a point of transformation, even if I still didn't know how to act. It was as if that wound had opened a door to new revelations, which would inevitably change the way I would experience my journey from then on. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely in this space of shock and shame that we begin to understand how pain can transform into an unexpected force, capable of leading us to decisions that forever change the trajectory of our lives. What came after that episode was even more painful than the words he had hurled at me, because somehow I believed that, even if I was exposed, someone would stand up, someone would reach out, remind me that I wasn't alone. But instead, what I found was an icy silence. Friends who had previously shared confidences with me looked away. Spiritual leaders I admired chose not to get involved, as if my pain were an irrelevant detail compared to the community's good image. It was at that moment that the feeling of abandonment became almost unbearable, and I began to realize how cruel it is to be surrounded by people and yet feel completely invisible. It was as if I'd been erased. The messages that once arrived on my phone stopped coming. The invitations to chat and meetups dwindled, and little by little, loneliness became a constant shadow. I wondered, was I to blame? Had the good Christian image I'd carried shattered so easily in their eyes? This doubt gnawed at my mind night after night, because it seemed no one wanted to hear my side of the story. The impact on my mindset was profound. I began to question not only my relationships, but also my faith, the space I occupied, and even the value of my own voice. The hardest part was realizing that some chose to support him. They justified his actions, saying he was just joking, that I shouldn't take it so seriously. And when I tried to explain how much it hurt, the response was always the same: forgive, move on, don't cause trouble. It sounded like an order to shut up, to accept the pain as if it were normal, almost inevitable. And inside me, the wound of abandonment opened wider and wider. I didn't just want someone to agree with me, I wanted someone to be by my side, who would see the injustice and have the courage to speak out. But no one did. This revelation hit me hard. Sometimes, the silence of others hurts more than the words that directly affect us. I learned bitterly that it's not just those who humiliate us that mark us, but also those who choose to turn a blind eye when they could defend us. And this feeling of abandonment profoundly affected my journey, because it led me to rethink what community, support, and love for others truly mean. Deep down, it was there that I realized I needed a transformation, not only in how I handled my relationships, but also in how I understood faith. Because it's not enough to talk about love and compassion in public if, behind the scenes, we leave someone bleeding alone. This was the hidden truth that hit me like a shock. I could no longer expect others to validate my pain. I needed to learn to face it and somehow move through it. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the way we deal with abandonment reveals not only who is around us, but also who we really are when everything falls apart, and we have to decide whether we will remain silent or find the courage to stand up. The imposed silence was perhaps one of the cruelest phases of this entire journey. After the humiliation and abandonment, I still hoped someone, at least in private, would tell me, "I saw what happened, you didn't deserve this." But that's not what I heard. What came were phrases that sounded like spiritual advice, but which, in practice, acted like chains to keep me silent. Don't exaggerate, it wasn't that serious. You need to learn to forgive quickly, otherwise you'll give the enemy an opening. Don't ruin your testimony. Keep calm and move on. Each of these words seemed designed to stifle my pain, as if a woman's dignity were less important than preserving a community's image of perfection. I began to feel like my voice had no space. It was as if every attempt to speak was interpreted as rebellion, as if expressing the hurt were a greater sin than the error of the one who caused it. This kind of mentality has a devastating impact because it undermines self-confidence, pushing you into a place of forced silence. The weight of this lies not only in the phrases we hear, but in the hidden truth they carry, the collective fear of exposing flaws, of showing that real life isn't as clean as the image it portrays. This silence made me question the essence of the faith I so strongly defended. Did God really want me to sacrifice myself to protect the reputation of others? Did Christ's love manifest itself in ignoring someone's pain in the name of apparent peace? These questions haunted me through sleepless nights when tears mingled with prayers that seemed unanswered. It was an internal conflict. On one hand, the desire to scream, to expose everything. On the other, the weight of carrying the wound alone, believing that speaking out would tarnish my own testimony. And it was in this suffocating environment that I began to see how decisions shaped by fear don't free us. They only imprison us even further. Realizing this was the beginning of a silent transformation within me, because I began to understand that forgiveness can't be demanded as a cold obligation, but must arise from a process of genuine healing. Otherwise, it becomes just another mask to hide what's bleeding inside. This imposed silence wasn't just external, coming from friends and leaders, but also internal. I began to silence myself, convincing myself that I had no right to feel, that I needed to be strong, that I needed to protect my image as a woman of faith. But deep down, it was simply fear of confronting the truth. And this hidden truth is harsh. When faith is used to silence rather than liberate, something essential is lost. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely at this point, when the voice is muffled and the pain is hidden, that many women stop recognizing who they really are and begin to live a distorted version of themselves, carrying burdens that should never be theirs. The pain of betrayal didn't just begin the moment he exposed me in front of everyone, but it accumulated in every detail I ignored, every time I closed my eyes to avoid facing reality. When the penny finally dropped, I felt so deeply deceived that it seemed impossible to pick up the pieces of my trust. It was as if someone had ripped the ground out from under me, and suddenly, everything I believed about love, respect, and complicity was called into question. The feeling of being diminished in front of so many people was a wound that lingered for a long time. It wasn't just the shame of being exposed. It was the pain of realizing that the man I had placed my dreams in had no regard for my dignity. This feeling of loneliness was one of the most intense. Even surrounded by people, I felt isolated within my own world. The conversations around me seemed distant, as if I'd been ripped from that space and placed in a bubble of silence. I looked at people and wondered if anyone truly saw the gravity of what I was experiencing. It was like carrying a huge weight that no one seemed willing to help me hold. The hidden truth is that the loneliness of betrayal comes not only from the person who hurts us, but also from the absence of those who choose not to speak out. The impact this had on my mentality was devastating. I began to question not only him, but myself. Was I good enough? Had I done something to deserve this? These questions echoed like hammers in my mind, undermining the confidence I once had. With each reminder of the episode, I felt smaller, almost invisible, as if my voice had been ripped from within me. It was at this point that I realized that betrayal not only destroys trust in another person, but also threatens to destroy our own trust. And it's frightening how this pain can shape our journey. With each passing day, I found myself further from the confident young woman I once was. The revelations came in the form of silent tears, sleepless nights, and prayers that seemed unanswered. Betrayal is a scar that doesn't stop at the moment of the act. It continues to reverberate, creating cracks in the way we see ourselves and the world. This experience made me realize that the greatest transformation I needed to undergo would not be in relation to others, but in relation to myself. I needed to decide whether I would allow that pain to define me or whether I would find the strength within myself to reclaim my identity. And this decision would be crucial because it was clear that continuing to live trapped in the wound would only distance me further from who God called me to be. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject because the pain of betrayal, when not faced, can turn into an invisible prison. And understanding this was the first step in starting to find a way out of this labyrinth of pain and loneliness. I remember exactly the first time this question echoed within me. God, why did you let this happen to me? It was night. I was alone in my room, my eyes still swollen from crying, and it felt like the ceiling was going to collapse on me. I stared into space, unable to pray properly because words eluded me. Until then, my faith had always been my foundation, the safe place I ran to in any difficulty. But in that moment, it seemed as if even God had gone silent. I couldn't understand how, after so many years of dedication, of choices made to honor Him, I could be experiencing such great pain precisely within what should have been an environment of protection and love. This crisis of faith was one of the darkest periods of my journey. I went to church, but I felt distant. I sang in worship, but the lyrics no longer penetrated my heart in the same way. I opened the Bible, but the words seemed to leap from the pages, finding no place within me. It was as if I were living behind the scenes of a faith that seemed intact on the outside, but was full of cracks on the inside. The impact of this experience was so intense that I began to question even my own identity as a Christian. Was I being punished for something I couldn't see? Had my faith never been enough? These questions became part of my daily routine, and the more I tried to escape them, the more they came back to haunt me. What confused me most was realizing that other people looked at me and still saw the same dedicated, active, and seemingly strong young woman. No one imagined that, behind her smile, lay endless nights of tears and a mind filled with doubt. I learned the hard way that it's possible to be surrounded by people and still feel a deep emptiness within. This was the most uncomfortable revelation, that faith can be tested precisely in the places where we think we're most secure. I didn't want to abandon my faith, but I could no longer relate to God in the same way. My prayers, once full of hope, turned into desperate questions. I sought quick answers, a solution that could erase the pain, but divine silence seemed even heavier than the silence of others. It was then that I began to understand that a crisis of faith is not the absence of God, but the transition between the faith we inherit from others and the faith that truly becomes our own. That was the moment I realized I was facing a decisive choice. Either I would let the pain completely distance me from God, or I would allow myself to dive even deeper, even without understanding, trusting that this process could transform me. This decision wasn't easy because it required courage to accept that I wouldn't have all the answers right away, and that perhaps some of them wouldn't come until much later. But it was precisely at this point that my journey began to take a new direction, a path of revelations that would forever change the way I view faith and myself. The fear of judgment was like a shadow that followed me every step of the way after that. I was already hurt, but what tormented me most was imagining what people were saying when I wasn't there. I feared the story would be told only through His own eyes, that my pain would be exaggerated or turned into drama. The possibility of being labeled a troubled woman consumed me. Within the church, this label weighs like a sentence because everything you do is interpreted through this distorted lens. I was afraid to open my mouth and be accused of gossiping, afraid to express my pain and be called weak in faith. This fear paralyzed me more than any word spoken against me. It was like living in a minefield where every gesture could be turned against me. If I cried, they said I was unbalanced. If I remained silent, they interpreted it as pride. If I tried to move forward, it seemed cold. It was an invisible but suffocating prison. The impact on my mindset was devastating because I began to believe that any move I made would confirm the negative expectations some had already created. I felt like I carried a disproportionate weight, as if I were responsible not only for my pain, but for the reputation of the entire community. This fear of judgment also distanced me from people who could help me. I withdrew, avoided deep conversations, and put on a mask of normalcy to avoid arousing suspicion. But behind the scenes, the hidden truth was that I was falling apart. This contradiction consumed me. On the outside, I still appeared strong. On the inside, I felt increasingly small. And the most painful thing was knowing that often the judgment didn't come from strangers, but from people close to me, those I hoped would understand me. Over time, I realized that this fear was also linked to a lifelong need for approval. I wanted to be seen as exemplary, someone who never made mistakes. And when all that fell apart, the feeling of failure was even greater. This was one of the hardest revelations, realizing that part of my imprisonment stemmed from the expectations I had nurtured. And this led me to an even deeper question. To what extent was I living for God? And to what extent was I living for the opinions of others? This questioning was the beginning of a transformation, because it made me understand that people's judgment can imprison me, but only if I give it more power than it deserves. Breaking free from this mindset was a painful but necessary process. It was as if I had to choose between continuing to carry an identity shaped by the gaze of others, or reclaiming the truth of who I truly was before God. Hitting emotional rock bottom was something I never imagined I'd experience. At first, I tried to hide it, putting on a mask of strength and normalcy so no one would notice. But inside, the pain consumed me. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. I'd toss and turn, reliving every word, every look, every silence that had hurt me. Insomnia became my companion, and with it came the silent tears I didn't want anyone to know. I cried in secret, as if even my crying were shameful, as if showing weakness would confirm the accusations swirling in my mind. Over time, even the simplest pleasures in life seemed to disappear. Food no longer tasted good, my appetite vanished, and I found myself standing at my plate, pushing food down without desire. My body began to reflect the pain I carried in my soul, thinner, weaker, and without energy. It was as if life was slowly draining from me. The impact of this phase was so profound that even activities that once filled me with joy lost their luster. Worship, which had always been my refuge, felt distant. Church gatherings, once moments of communion, became triggers for painful memories. Behind the scenes of my life, I was no longer the same. People still saw me smile occasionally, but that smile was empty, almost automatic. The hidden truth was that I was surviving, not living. My mind was plunged into a whirlwind of destructive thoughts, and each day was a silent struggle to get out of bed and accomplish the bare minimum. This period showed me how emotional pain can be as devastating, if not more so, than physical pain, because it corrodes from the inside out, and no one sees it. At the same time, this descent into the depths brought me important revelations. I realized that we often need to face the limits of our endurance to discover where our strength truly lies. But at that moment, I wasn't clear about this. I only felt darkness, the absence of hope, and the constant fear that nothing would change. It was at that point that I understood that hitting rock bottom isn't just a state of pain, but also a place of decision. It's there that you realize whether you'll let yourself sink for good, or whether, even without strength, you'll start searching for something that can lift you up. This journey to the depths was painful, but it also marked a silent turning point within me. I could no longer ignore the gravity of the situation. I needed to face what was happening to me head-on, even if it meant admitting my fragility. And it was precisely in this place of absolute weakness that I began to glimpse the possibility of transformation, something that would allow me to reclaim my identity and my faith in a completely different way. Little by little, I understood that depths weren't the end, but the beginning of a new stage, even though I had no idea how it would unfold. The void surrounding me felt suffocating, but it also became a space where new questions arose, questions that would somehow point me toward paths of healing and rebuilding that I couldn't yet clearly see. And when I remember that period when I seemed to be at rock bottom, I realize how much each detail of my story carries weight, but also value. It wasn't easy to expose my pain, and even today, it's not easy to relive it all in words. But I know That when I share it, this narrative can become a mirror for other women who also face silent battles. That's why every gesture of support here makes a difference. When you like this video, it's not just a button being pressed. It's like you're saying, this message matters. It needs to reach more people. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach women who may be experiencing exactly what I experienced. If this topic resonates with you, leave your thoughts in the comments below, because the exchange between us generates strength, generates hope, and shows that we are not alone on this journey. And it's in this spirit of community that I continue to share, because I know that each word can carry revelations that might help someone rise up. After all, when pain is shared truthfully, it transforms into the possibility of healing. And it was precisely from this profound emptiness that I began to take the first, still timid, steps toward a new mindset, a path of reconstruction that, little by little, began to unfold before me. Hitting rock bottom was painful, but it was there, in that place of utter fragility, that my first courageous step was born. I remember the day when, after another sleepless night, looking in the mirror with tired eyes and a haggard face, I thought, I can't go on like this. It was as if, amidst the darkness, a small spark of clarity had emerged. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I realized I needed to walk away from the relationship that was destroying me. The decision didn't come suddenly, but it slowly matured within me until it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a simple breakup, because it involved not only emotions, but also a whole context of community, external expectations, and even spiritual pressures. It was as if, by choosing to walk away from him, I was going against everything many expected of me. Fear paralyzed me, but at the same time, the feeling of remaining trapped in that toxic situation was unbearable. So I took a deep breath, and even with my heart racing, made the decision. I would no longer stay with someone who didn't respect my dignity. This first step brought me a mixture of relief and pain. Relief at finally breaking the cycle that was suffocating me. Pain at facing the reality that the dream I had nurtured was crumbling before my eyes. It was like dismantling a castle I had carefully built myself, brick by brick, only to discover that the foundation was compromised from the start. This revelation was difficult to accept, but at the same time, it brought clarity. I understood that to experience true transformation, I would need to begin by letting go of what seemed beautiful on the outside, but hid a hidden truth of pain and disrespect. The first few weeks were intense. I felt vulnerable, like someone relearning to walk. There were times when the fear of judgment almost made me turn back, but something inside me already knew there was no turning back. Each day, I needed to reinforce my decision in my mind, reminding myself that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. This process showed me that the backstage of courage is often silent. There is no applause, no immediate recognition, only the internal struggle to hold firm to a choice that hurts but liberates. And it was on this uncertain journey that I began to rediscover a hidden part of myself. I realized it wasn't just about ending a relationship, but about reclaiming my identity, about choosing to no longer live diminished. This first step was small in the eyes of others, but for me, it was gigantic, because it paved the way for a new journey of healing and self-discovery. After taking that first courageous step and walking away from the relationship that was suffocating me, I found myself facing a huge void. It was as if part of me had been left behind, and at the same time, I knew I couldn't go back. It was in this space of uncertainty that I began to seek refuge where I always believed I would find it, in God. Many nights I simply couldn't sleep, and the early morning hours became my altar. There, in the silence, when no one else was watching, I poured myself out in prayer, sometimes without words, just with tears that flowed uncontrollably. I felt that weeping was the language the Lord understood best at that moment. It was also during this period that the Psalms became my daily companion. Each verse seemed to speak directly to me, as if David had written those words amid my own pain. When I read, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted," it felt like God was whispering to me, "I am here." This connection didn't immediately erase the pain, but it brought a ray of hope, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. Entire early mornings were spent like this, with the Bible open, tears on my face, and a sense that even without answers, I was being sustained by a presence greater than myself. This process wasn't linear. There were days when prayer felt like a sincere outburst, and others when it sounded like a cry of despair. But it was precisely in this vulnerability that I began to understand the true meaning of seeking God. It wasn't about pretty prayers or well-formulated phrases, but about opening my heart with all the mess, with all the confusion, and letting Him see what I myself was afraid to face. This revelation brought me a silent transformation, because little by little I realized that I didn't need to hide my pain from God. On the contrary, it was there that I should expose every wound, every doubt, every weakness. Behind the scenes of my soul, something was happening. I still cried, still felt small, but I could already sense glimpses of peace amidst the chaos. It was as if, amid the weight of abandonment and judgment, I had found a secret haven. This search for God didn't change my reality overnight, but it began to shift my mindset. And when that happens, even if the circumstances are still difficult, the way I face them is no longer the same. This journey of early morning prayer was a turning point. I understood that, more than immediate answers, God wanted to teach me to trust, to rest, to believe that there was a purpose, even in what seemed like mere pain. And this trust, though fragile at first, grew stronger with each tear shed at the Lord's feet, with each word of the Psalms that became life within me. Little by little, amidst tears and late-night prayers, I began to realize something that completely changed the way I saw myself. For so long, I had let humiliation, betrayal, and even the silence of those around me define me. It was as if my identity had been reduced to the label of the one who was exposed, the one who couldn't hold on to a relationship, the one carrying a problem. But it was precisely in that moment of sincere seeking God that a revelation began to blossom within me. I was not what they did to me. I was not the shame I carried. I was loved and chosen by Christ. This rediscovery was like breathing again after a long suffocation. I remember reading verses that spoke about being children of God, created with purpose, and suddenly those words stopped being theoretical and became true for me. It was as if I heard His voice saying, "You are not your wound. You are not your past. You are my beloved daughter." This brought about a profound transformation because my mindset began to shift. I no longer looked in the mirror and saw only someone broken, but someone in the process of rebuilding, someone who had value regardless of the opinions of others. Of course, this change didn't happen magically or instantly. I still struggled with thoughts of inferiority, still felt the weight of memories, but the difference was that now I had a different foundation. I knew my identity was no longer tied to human gaze, but to God's. This gave me the strength to start lifting my head, to no longer accept living cowered by fear of judgment. It was like a process of internal revelations in which I was reminded every day, my life is not defined by wounds, but by the grace that reached me. This rediscovery also led me to make different decisions. I began to distance myself from environments and people that reinforced the idea that I was less than. I began investing time in activities that reconnected me with who I truly was, singing, writing, being silent in the presence of God. Each small step showed me that there was no going back to the old version of myself, because now I understood the hidden truth that had always been there. The identity that Christ's love gives us is unshakable, even when the world tries to reduce us to our pain. And so it was that, amidst a scenario of loss, I began to experience a new freedom. The freedom to no longer depend on people's approval, the freedom to see myself through the eyes of faith, and the freedom to believe that my worth was never conditioned by my experience, but by what God had already declared about me. This revelation impacted not only me, but also how I began to relate to others, because now I knew that no one could steal the essence of what Christ had placed within me. The rebuilding of my self-esteem didn't happen all at once, like a button someone pressed, and suddenly everything was fine. It was born in small details, in gestures that might seem insignificant to outsiders, but to me were immense. After so long feeling dull, almost non-existent, I began to realize that life still had color and that I could feel it again, little by little. The first victory was simple, a spontaneous smile. I remember the day I, unplanned, laughed at something silly a friend told me, and realized that my heart, even wounded, still had room for lightness. That smile felt like a spark of hope, as if I remembered that joy hadn't been stolen forever, just dormant. Another important step was returning to singing in worship. For a long time, I felt stuck. I would stand at the altar with the microphone in my hands, but my voice came out cold and lifeless. It was as if each note reminded me of the pain, as if the space where I once found refuge had become a stage for suffocating memories. But one day, while singing, something changed. I closed my eyes and, instead of thinking about the people around me, I simply let myself be carried away by the music, the words, the presence of God that seemed to envelop me again. I felt tears welling up, but this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of liberation. It was at that moment that I realized that music, which had always been my most sincere form of expression, was being used as an instrument of healing. Taking care of myself was also part of this reconstruction. After months of looking in the mirror and not recognizing the woman reflected there, I decided to recapture simple habits. Fixing my hair, choosing clothes that made me feel good, allowing myself small gifts like a special coffee or a walk alone. These seemingly trivial details reminded me daily that I deserved affection, even if it was from me to myself. It was an important revelation that I didn't need to wait for someone to value me to start treating myself as someone valuable. Each of these small victories shaped a new mindset within me. I began to realize that self-esteem isn't about feeling perfect, but about recognizing one's own dignity, even when everything around us tries to make us believe otherwise. It was like rebuilding a house that had been demolished, brick by brick, with patience, knowing that the process takes time, but also understanding that each step has its impact. And the further I progressed, the more I understood that the foundation of this new construction couldn't be based on external opinions, but on something much more solid, the certainty of who I was in God. This journey of reconstruction brought me unexpected revelations. One of them was realizing that life isn't just about great achievements, but mainly about these intimate moments, often invisible to others, but which carry immense power. Smiling again, singing again, taking care of myself again, all of this showed me that I was regaining control of my story. It was like recovering pieces of myself that had been ripped away and reassembling them into an even stronger version, even more aware of its value. The behind the scenes of this transformation wasn't easy. There were days when I'd relapse, when I'd look in the mirror and still feel the weight of the pain. But even then, I no longer saw myself as I once did, because now I knew that every failure was part of the journey, and that every new beginning was a decision not to give up on myself. This was perhaps the greatest victory, realizing that I didn't need to wait for anyone's approval to believe my life had value. And so, step by step, I began rebuilding myself, not as the same woman as before, but as someone renewed, with scars that now told a story of overcoming. I discovered that self-esteem isn't about never having been hurt, but about choosing not to let those wounds determine our destiny. This was the hidden truth that finally revealed itself to me. I could be whole again, even after everything. When I began to stand up, still timidly, and show that I was rebuilding my life, people's reactions were completely different, and each one had a profound impact on how I viewed my journey. Some looked at me with suspicion, as if my decision to walk away from that relationship was merely a whim or an act of rebellion. I heard comments that tried to belittle my choices. Maybe you weren't patient enough. Could it have been a lack of forgiveness? You're complicating something that could have been resolved with more prayer. These phrases felt like daggers, because they showed that, for many, my pain was still invisible. It was as if the effort to rebuild myself wasn't recognized, but rather questioned. This kind of criticism made me fight the temptation to doubt myself again, but at the same time, it taught me to rely less on external validation. On the other hand, there were those who finally opened their eyes and began to support me. Friends who had previously remained silent began reaching out with simple gestures that made all the difference. An unexpected message, an invitation for coffee, a word of encouragement. Leaders who previously didn't know how to handle the situation began to truly listen to me, without judgment, just with a sincere desire to be present. This belated support showed me that not everyone distances themselves out of malice. Sometimes, people simply don't know how to react to another's pain and need time to understand. These contrasting reactions taught me a lot about human relationships. I realized that behind the scenes in life, there will always be those who judge us based on their own limitations and those who can see beyond, who recognize our courage in the midst of struggle. This revelation helped me create a new mindset. I could no longer live a prisoner of criticism, but I also couldn't depend entirely on support. I needed to find a balance where my identity and my decisions weren't shaped by what they said, but by the conviction of who I was becoming. At the same time, it was inevitable to feel the weight of judgment from those close to me, people I never imagined would walk away. Some disapproving looks spoke louder than any words. It was as if my story had become a spectacle in which everyone had an opinion, but few truly cared. This impact was harsh, but it brought a liberating revelation. I no longer needed to explain every step of my journey. Those who wanted to understand would. Those who didn't would remain stuck in their own version. And it was at this point that I began to experience an even more profound transformation, because I learned to value authenticity more than approval. At the same time, the support that emerged, however small, had a powerful effect. Each word of encouragement served as a reminder that I wasn't alone, that there were still people capable of seeing beyond appearances. I learned to cling to these signs of life, like flowers blooming in the desert. They didn't erase the pain, but they reminded me that the journey was worth it. And that's how I realized that the journey of overcoming isn't just about us, but also about how we learn to deal with the impact of external reactions, choosing what we let in and what we need to let go. This mix of criticism and support ended up being a training ground for my mentality. With each unfair comment, I strengthened my resolve not to back down. With each gesture of support, I was reminded that there was still beauty in human relationships. This duality made me grow, made me realize that life will always offer us both sides, and it's up to us to decide which one holds more space in our hearts. If this story touched your heart in any way, I invite you to join me in this space of exchange and truth. Often, what we need most is to realize that we are not alone, that other women have also faced pain, difficult decisions, and revelations that completely changed their paths. So, if something I've shared here resonated with you, leave a little about your experience in the comments, because your voice could be just the encouragement someone else needs to read today. Your participation is essential, because that's what brings this channel to life, transforming each story into a true support network. I also encourage you to subscribe, because each new video is designed to bring stories, reflections, and lessons that can transform your mindset and strengthen your journey. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with a friend who might be going through a similar phase, because the hidden truth is that when we share hope, it multiplies.